Hi everyone, welcome to UGC 112, World Civilizations 2, spring semester. We're going to be picking up where UGC 111 stopped, which is right around the 15th century CE, AD. Either one is fine, the Common Era or Anno Domini. They mean exactly the same thing. Like I said, we're not going to have to deal with that much because we are exclusively in the Common Era. So before we move on with the rest of the semester, I figured it would be a good idea to go back over what we did in 111. So we started off in the Stone Age, obviously named for the material of the tools, stone, and this happens all over the world. Throughout the world there are different Stone Ages, and they happen at different times, in fact. So it's a little bit of a misnomer that there is a Stone Age, when in fact there are many Stone Ages. And you'll remember that there are different levels of the Stone Age, different phases. The Paleolithic, meaning the Old Stone Age, the Neolithic, the New Stone Age. Then you have the Chalcolithic, which is like this early Copper Bronze Age, heading into the Bronze Age. They, of course, had settlements as the Stone Age progressed. More stable food supplies means more people, and it also means that some people can begin to specialize on certain tasks. Some people would become farmers, others would become, stone workers, hunter-gatherers, whatnot. And then communities began to form, and they continued to coalesce into, eventually we get to city-states and then civilizations as well. Now, we started off right around here in the Fertile Crescent, or Mesopotamia. There it is, right here. You can see it kind of makes a crescent shape, and that's why it's called the Fertile Crescent. Mesopotamia meaning between the two rivers. There. In Mesopotamia, you'll remember things like Sumer, around 3000 BC. We have things like ziggurats that developed. This one's the ziggurat of Ur. You get some great kings eventually ruling over city-states or civilizations. This figure right here is Sargon of Akkad. And then, of course, we remember Hammurabi and his code. So we see writing, more complex religions, art, laws, governments beginning to develop out of the Stone Age into a Bronze Age. And this is what happens here in Mesopotamia. And it also happens in Egypt, which is very, very close by, right in this area here. Also, obviously there's the pyramids. Very, very famous. Egypt is famous for their pyramids. And they have writing, these hieroglyphics here, art, great gold work, stonework, very well known for. Also had, complex laws, kings, and an empire. So very similar to Mesopotamia in that way. We see the development of civilization in the area of Greece, on Crete, and then later the mainland, with first off the Minoans in Crete. Let me go back to that. There's the Minoans there. You can see their palace complex. So they have complex social structures. They have writing as well, art. And basically this is what we've seen in other areas, and the Mycenaeans are the same. They also have palace structures, writing, and art here. This develops, civilization develops in the Indus Valley right here in northwestern India as well, with the Indus Valley civilization, sometimes called the Harappans. You can see it, again, is also around a river, just like we saw in Mesopotamia, and Egypt was around the Nile. We have the Indus River here. There's some of their architecture there. possibly had writing, complex religion they definitely had, and social structure as well. Civilization also develops in China. And we see early on the Shang dynasty with their writing around 1500 BC, writing, complex religion. They used stone tools actually, but they did have bronze. Used it exclusively for art and religious items. They would later be taken over by the Zhou. You can see them off to the west over here. And then there were lots of different wars throughout China. And you'll remember in China, there developed three major philosophical systems: Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism. And these are all just different ways of structuring society, viewing society, and almost the religious aspects to them as well. Then China would be united under the first emperor, Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi. There he is right there wearing some lovely hat that looks like a board, but it's got little tassels on it, so that's neat. And he also was the one who ordered the creation of the terracotta stone, or the terracotta army that was there to protect his tomb. Bit of a control freak, the first emperor of China was. If you remember, he died from drinking mercury because he wanted to live forever. Mercury doesn't really rust or do much, it doesn't corrupt anyway, so he thought by drinking that he would be uncorruptible, and then he dies. China, of course, the Great Wall also started to be solidified under the first emperor, but this is continued on throughout Chinese history, and this nice stretch here would be much later improvements, and improvements by later dynasties. Because they built this Great Wall because there was, of course, always the constant threat from the north, and we'll see that a little bit later, that the north is still a threat to China, even in the periods that we're going to be talking about. Heading back over to Greece, we talked about the Bronze Age in Greece. You also, in World Civilizations 1, talked about classical Greece, or sometimes just called ancient Greece. You'll remember both Athens and Sparta. Athens kind of known more for their artistic side and their naval power. Sparta, really strong military. You probably saw 300. Of course, they had their art and architecture, city-states developed there, and for Western culture, Greece is a really huge impact. You probably have seen these buildings and the statues, Greek vases before. And of course, on this one here, we can see democracy was taking place in some city-states in Greece. Here it's on a vase. Also, big impact on Western medicine, mathematics. Here we can see a piece of Pythagoras there. And philosophy. We have our three big Greek philosophers: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. And of course, when you talked about Aristotle, probably then talked about his famous student, Alexander the Great, who led this massive army all around the ancient Middle East, Egypt, even as far as India, and he creates this very large empire, but an empire that was only unified under him, and once he dies, it collapses pretty quickly, and dies at the age of 33, so poor Alexander. Then after that, a bunch of different smaller kingdoms developed that were still Greek-led. until the Indians down here overthrew the Greeks in the area and set up their own kingdoms there. You'll remember like the Mauryans and the Gupta kingdoms. And of course, India has their three major religions that we talked about: Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism. Closely linked to the Greeks were the Romans, who were over here in Italy. This nice little boot here. There's Rome. This is a pretty early depiction, or a pretty early model of what early Rome would have looked like. City-state started around 756 BCE, ruled by kings, and then eventually it becomes a republic until the actions of men like Julius Caesar here and Augustus, his grandnephew, and then adopted son, would then overthrow the republic and make it into an empire. Like the Greeks, major impact on architecture, medicine, literature, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and especially their government. Like we said, they had a republic that would be an influence to later republics, including ours, and then emperors kind of set the way that people would in Europe would try to rule. They always were trying to be like the Romans. We saw that a little bit with Charlemagne, and we'll still see it even in this semester with figures like Napoleon. A lot of influence from Rome. Why was Rome such a big influence? Because it was very, very successful at controlling a lot of land. Here you can basically see the entire area around the Mediterranean was controlled by Rome. They went all the way down into the Fertile Crescent to the Persian Gulf over here, up into Great Britain. And this is, of course, its largest extent under the Emperor Trajan, around 117 CE. We then saw the Roman Empire being so large that it actually had to be split in two eventually, with the West and the East. And the West eventually would fall, but it's important to remember, even up until our times that we're talking about in our class, there were people called they still called themselves the Romans, and they were still a state. We call them the Byzantines to kind of separate, to make it a little bit clearer for ourselves, but they themselves still called themselves the Romans. They still believed that they were the remnants of that same state that started in 756 BCE, and we will see the collapse finally of this Roman state during this semester. So keep that in the back of your mind, that the Romans collapsed in the West, but the East kept going until we'll see it. During the Romans, we also see in the East, Diocese of the East, here you can see it, there's Jerusalem there. We of course see the rise of a new religion out of Judaism, and a religion that's really going to sweep through the Roman Empire, and it's going to stick around, and it's going to be very, very important whenever we're talking about Europe this semester, to think of Christianity and its impacts through the Catholic Church early on, and then the Protestant Reformation. And we'll see little bits of this and the influence of this religion throughout this semester. We also looked into kingdoms in Africa, kingdoms like Ghana, and here you can see some of the remains of Ghana. Around 900 CE, cities based on trade, right along the Niger River. Here is the Sahara Desert up there. Then we saw Mali, pretty much in the same area as Ghana, took over Ghana. This is around the year 1200 CE about, very, very rich in trade again. This area down here is called the Gold and Ivory Coast. There's lots of gold there. And in fact, it was so rich that this king right here, Mansa Musa, was known throughout Europe even for how rich he was. This is actually a Spanish depiction of Mansa Musa, an early Catalan depiction. He's holding a giant gold nugget because everybody knew that he had so much gold. How much gold did he have? Well, he was a Muslim, so once Islam comes into Western Africa, people would then go back to Mecca, and he did that as well. That's part of the faith. He was so wealthy that when he went across Africa to all the different little stops, and then even down into the Arabian Peninsula, at the little towns that he would stop off, he would spend so much money that he actually ruined the economies of many of these local little cities. Because things would become, the prices would become so inflated because he had all this gold. So very, very rich, one of the richest people that we saw last semester. In the eastern part of Africa, you'll remember Aksum, which is in the area of Ethiopia. It was a city-state, but then began to control areas larger, the areas around it, just like Rome did. Not quite as large, and this is happening around 300 to 900 CE. Unlike the western part of Africa, Aksum was actually a Christian state, a very, very early form of Christianity. No ties to the Catholic Church in Europe. They practiced another type of Christianity that was developing at the same time of what became Catholicism was developing. So they're around 300 to 900 CE, especially known for their obelisks that they built. This is an obelisk here. Down along this coast here, even stretching further, there were these Swahili city-states that controlled the trade of the Indian Ocean. Those were Muslim. We talked about the Americas. You'll remember the Mayans, based on the Yucatan Peninsula. They were especially known for their writing, for their astronomy, complex religion, the step pyramids, which was part of their complex religion, kings, art. One interesting thing about the Mayans, they were technically a Stone Age people throughout their entire existence because they used stone tools and weapons. But you can see very, very advanced, very much, they were a civilization that just used stone tools and stone weapons. So don't think of them as any more primitive than any of the other people that we've gone through in this overview. Same thing with the Aztecs. Here's the Yucatan Peninsula where the Mayans were. There's the Aztecs a little bit to the west, in modern-day Mexico. Around 1325 to 1519 or so. Much more warlike people than the Mayans. They had writing, a complex religion. They also built step pyramids, art, and here we see their stone weapons. This is a wooden sword that along it has pieces of obsidian, sharp volcanic glass along the edges to make the blades. You can see them stuck all throughout the sword. Down in South America, on the western coast, we saw the Incas, the Incan Empire, roughly around 1000 to 1532 CE. They had writing, complex religion, art, very well known for their roads and their vast empire connected by these roads. And because they were up in the mountains, they were known for their steppe farming as well. They'd level off certain areas that would make so that they could farm them. and like the other American civilizations that we talked about, use stone tools and stone weapons to create all their amazing developments. We also looked a little bit into medieval Europe. Here is Charlemagne, in fact. We mentioned him just recently. The development of this Holy Roman Empire, these German kings who fancied themselves as the inheritors of the Romans. We could see the Byzantine Empire here, and this is the timeline for this, roughly. The borders are going to change throughout medieval Europe, but this is a rough idea of what this was. Byzantine Empire, Holy Roman Empire, and Rome right down here, where the Pope was seated. These were all major factors, major players in the world of medieval Europe. And now this is something that, when we're talking about medieval Europe, we have to talk about the feudal system, feudalism. This is going to be very important for the next lecture, so I want you to take a look and kind of, draw this out, think about it. What we have is a pyramid, basically, where we have the king on top of the social system, nobles underneath him, knights and vassals underneath those nobles, and then you get not just peasants. This is not the greatest pyramid shown. I liked it because it shows, because of all the stuff on the sides, which we'll get into in just a second. But you did have people who owned small little plots of land. Peasants were tied to the land, and there were some slaves as well. But the main idea of feudalism is that the king owns all the land. He's on top. He gives some of that land out to nobles, who give some of that land out to their knights, who then have the peasants and the freed people working for them. So we see land going down, land and protection going down, because the knights were the main military force. And in return for this, the peasants and the freed workers would be working, would give food and services for being able to live on this land. So they'd give part of the food that they were producing to the knights and vassals, who would also give some of those food and services to the nobles. But the knights especially were about protection and military service for the nobles, because the nobles had an obligation to the king, who gave, the king gave them land. In return, they would give the king money and the use of those knights. The nobles were kind of the ones who gathered up the army. The king was in charge of leading the war, but the nobles gathered up those troops, and they were kind of, they were underneath him in the chain of command. So they would be able to command the knights underneath them with the king's orders. And of course the knights would listen to the kings as well, but the nobles were the ones who had to gather them. And so this is the system that we're going to be looking at during the next lecture. But we're going to see how it changes a bit towards the end. This is a system that works in medieval Europe, develops there, and is pretty rigid. But as Europe changes, the feudalism begins to break down, and we're going to look at that next time in the next lecture. So I hope this recap was helpful, so that, just to give us a refresher of what we learned last semester, and then this focus on feudalism will hopefully propel us into the next lecture. All right, this is Greg signing off.